Eric Rosen's favorite opening in chess is the Stafford Gambit. He loves it for all the traps it has to offer. So I'm going to show you 3 of the best traps from White's main responses, and then we'll take a look at one of Eric's games to see how he likes to play the middle games if that doesn't work out. So the Stafford starts out e4, e5, which we have on the board. White will then play knight f3, and we play knight f6, which is a relatively rare move. Almost everyone will play knight c6, defending the pawn, but we're going to allow White to take. Now, something if you want to play the Stafford Gambit is you have to be pretty comfortable in these e4, e5 positions because a lot of players will just play boring chess and just play something like knight c3 here. So just know we can't always get the Stafford. You have to be prepared for those normal just e4, e5 games. But anyway, if they take, the Gambit starts by, we don't want to recapture this pawn. That can lead to some messy complications anyway. We're going to start the Gambit here by playing knight c6. Now, we're offering our opponent to take the knight. Again, they can jump back and be boring, but most of the times, they're going to take the knight. And now you have a choice. You can either take with the b pawn or the d pawn, but in the Stafford, definitely take with the d pawn. The reason for this is you are taking away from the center, which generally is against the rules of chess, but the reason why this gambit is so good is we're quickly opening up our bishop, and we're opening up the queen, which can move this way to get some checkmating threats. So keep that in mind. This is the position for the Stafford. So a big disclaimer to make with the Stafford Gambit is to have a quick look at the engine. It is plus 1.7, which is pretty disastrous, but if you look at the statistics of just like normal beginner and intermediate players, Black actually wins most of the games from this position. It's about a 53% win rate, which is modest but good. And the reason for it is we're not playing against Stockfish. We're not playing against these super high engines, and you're going to see some of the traps that players can fall into. And on top of that, there is just a lot of compensation like we're talking about. We have these open lines, we have the queen. So if you want to play the Stafford, you have to be okay kind of ignoring the engine. Now, there's 3 main responses for White, which we'll take a quick look at before the Eric game. There's d3, knight c6, and then the other move you'll see is e5. I'll cover them in order. The e5 one is particularly funny because the engine hates the response that Eric likes to do, but the trap is epic. So first, let's start out with d3. So against d3, and in most setups of the Stafford, the bishop belongs on c4, and that's because it's eyeing up that weak pawn on f2. Even if White castles, this bishop is still a monster staring at that pawn, and there's a few lines we'll see later where that works out. So White in this spot is just trying to develop his kingside as quickly as possible, try and castle and just hang on to that extra pawn, but we play h5, playing aggressively, going after their throat, and if White castles here, we have to move knight g4. Now this is just activating our knight, putting some pressure here, and White can't really take. If they take here, we recapture with our pawn, and then our rook is open. The queen can come in and threaten checkmate. So that is very risky. We're actually going to see that play out in Eric's game later. But what a lot of players will do here is they'll play h3, and the awesome move to remember here is we can completely ignore it and play queen d6. Now, basically, this is a checkmate threat. We're threatening checkmate there, and White only has a single move to not completely lose the game here, which is this crazy pawn sacrifice e5. I don't think any beginner's finding that, and you'll see why it's just such a disaster. The pawn can't really take because once this pawn recaptures, again, that checkmate threat is there. We also have, again, if they just ignore checkmate, if the bishop takes, same problem. So what a lot of players will do here, and this looks like it saves the day, other than that pawn sacrifice we talked about, is g3. But you can see this is actually mate in 2 because we can just take that pawn. Like I was saying, this bishop is the hero. It is pinning this pawn. The pawn can't take. King h1 is forced, and then we have checkmate. Now, the next trap is even more common because a lot of players will play knight c3 here, again, defending that pawn. We put our bishop on c5, same as normal, and if they mirror us playing bishop c4, this is already a big mistake because, again, we can jump our knight forward. White might think this is fine, just castle and go, look, my rook is defending that f2 pawn, but here's the move we have. We have queen h4 this time, and it is a double attack. We're attacking f2. We're also threatening mate here on h2, so they'll play h3, but now we have knight taking. You can see this is already a disaster for White, and if they're not careful, let's say they just move their queen, this is actually mate in 3, a little checkmating pattern to remember. Double check, king has to move, double check again, king has to move, and then checkmate. Again, you can see just how quickly these games finish in the Stafford. The last trap I'll show you is definitely the trickiest because it's pretty funny. If they play e5 here, pushing the pawn forward to defend it, the best engine move is to just centralize your knight and you're doing fine. But what Eric likes to play is jumping his knight forward to e4, which the engine despises. You can see it's +2, but the trap here is just awesome. Now, think about what is the natural move for white here. What might you play? If the answer was d3, that is so wrong, but I would not blame you at all because the idea is, again, we play bishop c5, always looking for this move, and the tactics work out here. If they take the knight, we can play bishop check, and suddenly this queen stare-off is going to work in our favor. The king can't take the bishop because then this queen loses the defender, and we'd win it. So if they try and run away, it doesn't matter. We're still going to win that queen because the other bishop comes out. Literally, the king has to take that bishop finally, and we win a queen and are absolutely chilling in the middle game. So now we'll take a look at the Eric Rosen game. He's up against the FM Gafkins, and we have e4, e5, like we're talking about, knight f3, knight f6, the Petrov. But like I was saying, a lot of players will be a bit boring here. They'll just play knight c3, but what Eric likes to do is just beg them to take the pawn, continue to leave it undefended, develop this bishop, and in this case, our opponent decides to take, Eric offers the exchange, they take, and we get our Stafford. It's a bit of a transposition. They've played knight c3, so it's like those lines we saw earlier, and now they're just going to develop normally, and Eric's going to throw his queen straight into the action. Again, white just wants to castle immediately, get over all these problems, which they do. But the problems, they don't stop. First, we play h5. We saw this earlier. White prepares to develop his dark square bishop, but now here comes the knight, piling up on this f2 pawn, which white can't defend too easily. So they decide to take here. They recapture, and because the queen is over here, the queen can't immediately exploit how weak this h2 piece is now. Sorry, the pawn. But the long-term compensation is going to be quite difficult to handle. So white's first move is to drop the knight back, attacking the queen. I thought that e3 looks really natural here, but the problem is that the queen can always drop back here with tempo, because remember, that is a big checkmate threat. So it makes sense. White is just bringing pieces closer to the king, getting ready to defend this onslaught that's about to come. So Eric moves his queen over, getting it ready to maybe threaten that h2 pawn. White expands in the center and, very importantly, cuts off this bishop's scope. The bishop just has to drop back for now. It couldn't go back here or else they'd get forked. And now this bishop is a bit out of commission, and white looks like they're hanging on, and the engine agrees. So they continue to just develop, solidify that d4 square, and now Eric starts pushing his pawns. The reason for this is he doesn't want the bishop to get to the f4 square. That would then be able to defend the h2 square. So he pushes the pawn. White now brings the queen up, threatening to take the pawn there. But Eric first counterattacks the h2 pawn. White decides to push it here, and now Eric trades. Here comes white taking the pawn, and Eric makes a pretty big mistake here. Now, I think he may have just miscalculated, but he decides to just allow the queen trade, and you can see this is actually terrible. But the reason why it's strange is because white's king is so unsafe that it makes a lot of sense to try and keep this queen on the board. But I think Eric miscalculates here, decides to take the pawn, thinking that after the queen takes, you can take the rook as well with the pawn and promote. But the problem is white can just recapture, and then Eric throws in a bit of a queen check here, sorry, bishop check, because once you take the queen, your rook leaves, and suddenly you're still just a pawn down. So big miss there for Eric, but the game continues. It's not looking as good though, because as we get closer to an endgame, that pawn disadvantage and the whole problem of these pawns being a bit stacked here is going to start to build up. So Eric starts out by centralizing his king, moving it forward and allowing this rook to move over. The king is just a lot more helpful here as well, because if it does get to an endgame, he wants to be more centralized. But he is on a dark square, which could maybe be a little bit difficult here with the bishop coming. Either way, white decides to push their pawn, just further supporting their center. And Eric swings the rook over, now contesting this, or controlling this g-file for now. And white moves their king up, same idea as Eric, just preparing for that endgame. Eric decides to get rid of this pawn, which makes sense. It was a bit of a weakness here, having both the pawns on the c-file. But first, white ignores that for now, offers the trade of rooks, which Eric declines. Now, it makes a lot of sense. He doesn't want to trade off all the pieces because then this big pawn center would be way too much to handle in those endgames. So, first, counterattacks the bishop. Bishop moves away with check. Eric decides to block with tempo. So now the bishop moves back here. Eric first trades, but white recaptures with the bishop. Now this has some long-term pressure on this f-pawn, which could be a problem. Eric decides to move his light-squared bishop back. Just didn't want to get pinned probably along this file, which makes a lot of sense. White now decides to infiltrate with their rook, but Eric decides to just block with the bishop for now. Things aren't looking great. White is still maintaining their advantage, but here comes a big blunder. They centralize their king further, but the problem, which they didn't see, is c5 just traps the bishop. The bishop actually has nowhere to go here. White decides just to ignore it for now, but Eric is going to collect that piece for the pawn, and now you have to think that Eric is feeling very confident here. Starts to activate his rook over here, not addressing this pin, which feels a bit risky, but you can see the engine is fine. And then when the knight moves, first Eric just drops back with the king, counterattacking that rook. Rook has to move. And then when Eric just takes the knight there, just simplifying the game further, exactly what he was trying to avoid earlier, White just decided to resign. This resignation feels early, but White is a bit down on the clock here and probably just morally defeated. But to the clock situation, this is a big advantage of playing those gambits, of playing these offbeat openings. Even if the engine doesn't love it, you can get that time advantage because you're so comfortable. You've seen these positions before, and your opponent has to be really careful. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. There should be a video above me that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy, so check that out. And other than that, I'll see you in the next video.